Hello, this is HannahMouse1 and welcome to a miniature artwork video. And in this video, I'm making Stampy's Hot Buns from Stampy's lovely world. I grew up with Stampy, and as a bit of a tribute to someone who made my childhood, I painted my nails Stampy style and made a Stampy's Hot Buns diorama. And I thought, why not bring you guys along? Enjoy the video. I started by making the base, which I cut out of a thin cardboard. Due to the blocky nature of Minecraft, while I'm absolutely doing a more realistic interpretation of the build, I had some very clear proportions and dimensions to work with, which was very helpful. I'm making this at a 1cm to block ratio. I then cut out some 1cm by 1cm squares to act as floor tiles, as well as a 1cm thick border for the building. I stuck all of these down, starting with the border, then arranging the tiles in an alternating pattern like a chessboard. I marked on some details, namely where the back door and the water in the garden would be, before building up all of the grass out of tissue scraps. And then I marked on the other door and the flooring where one of the walls should be. I'm going to keep that side open so you can see inside and see all the furniture and decorations. I then went on to painting the base, starting with the indented areas like the yellow glowstone floor tiles and the blue water. I actually changed my mind about what shade of blue I wanted to use and tried to change it without letting the first layer dry, and by happy accident it made a flowy watery look that worked really well. I did the grass in a bright green before painting the rest of the floor tiles. These were white except for the two rows furthest to the back of the store, which are black. I did the border in brown, leaving areas for detail anywhere that might be exposed. These areas I paint to look like the cross sections of spruce logs, using a lighter brown for the flesh of the wood. I added detail to the grass with a dark wash, of which I dabbed away the excess, and then I added some detail to the logs. I did some lighter yellow dry brushing on the grass for the added depth. I used UV resin to fill in the water, speeding up the drying process with a small UV torch. I also used the resin for the glowstone tiles, mixing in small amounts of orange paint into the resin to make them look warmer and more like the in-game block. I had forgotten to add the dirt for the wheat farm, so I painted that in and added some darker detailing before using gloss Mod Podge on all the white tiles to try and invoke a ceramic or marble material. I applied the wash that I used on the grass to the dirt patch, which both served to add depth and to better blend it in with the rest of the grass. Finally, I used a slightly watered down matte Mod Podge on anything that I hadn't yet given a finish. I only watered it down because it's quite old and I've had problems with it drying clear, but with that the base is done and I can move on to the walls. I started with the back wall as that one is the simplest. I want this to look like a log cabin. I made logs out of paper cylinders, and for the logs that will run horizontally between the two end logs, I cut indents into each side so that they fit in snugly. Assembling this was a tad bit fiddly because the glue didn't have much to hold onto. I basically just had to get it balanced in place long enough that I could seal it in with some tissue scraps, which had the double benefit of holding everything together and creating a nice bark texture. There's a bit more to the back wall. First I needed to do a door. It's not quite accurate to the in-game version, but I gave it a door frame, which I made by fixing tiny cardboard rectangles together with tiny pieces of folded paper. I cut out squared U-shapes for the front and back and attached those in the same way, and used more rectangles for the doors themselves. It was a bit flimsy, so I used more tissue scraps as reinforcement. I also needed a round window, so I cut the frame out for that as well. I drew out an oval shape and used a ruler to ensure that the frame had a consistent width. To cut out the center, I first pierced it with the felting awl in order to give my scissors an access point, and I needed two of these, so I traced around the first and repeated the process of cutting it out. I connected these two pieces with strips of paper on both the inside and outside edges of the border. I did this by creating a series of tiny hinges out of small strips of paper, then using those to attach the bigger strips. I then reinforced the frame with tiny thin sheets of tissue. I started with the inner strip before doing the outside one, and as the frame will be white anyway, I didn't bother with painting the paper. And once that was done, I started making the logs for the wall. These had to be cut down into the correct shapes and sizes to fit around the door and window. So these bottom two rows were short with a flat edge, and the ones to the left of the door had to be a bit shorter than the ones to the right to account for the door being off center. I fixed those in place using the same tissue method to hold things together. The next row stretches all the way across, but I had to cut in a small gap to accommodate the door frame, and this allowed it to slot in snugly, making it easier to attach. The next few rows were a bit harder as they had to account for the curve of the round window. Windows are 3 rows tall, with the bottom row having a steep curve, the middle ones being almost flat but with a slight indentation, and then the top row is the same as the bottom but upside down. I did have to trim this down to get it to fit with the existing end log, but I got things sorted. I attached the end log for the other side, then began the process of filling all the gaps with more scraps of tissue, especially around the door and window, but there were also a few spots between the logs that required patching. I did the entire inside of the wall before propping it up to repeat the process on the outside. The front of the building was much the same process, but unfortunately the footage got corrupted, so I won't be able to show you that, so let's jump straight into the paint job for the walls. I whipped up a patch of spruce brown paint and did a few coats over all the logs. It's actually kind of fiddly because there are so many nooks and crannies that it was hard to get the paint into, and because the pieces were basically held together by tissues that become flimsy flexible when wet, it was difficult to keep all the parts supported when they came a tad bit floppy. But after the brown base, I did a black wash, dabbing away the excess of a tissue so that the darker areas amassed in the recesses, and then did a heavy dry brush of a lighter brown to bring out some of the log texture. I also used the light brown for the doors and used a bright white for all of the frames. And once that was done, I stuck it onto the base. Now for the roof, I drew the front piece on white card. It's two slightly concave lines that meet at a point, and the bottom edge has a series of semicircular ridges to create a pseudo icing effect that the building is supposed to have. I cut the front piece out, and to make the back piece, I traced it and then cut that piece out as well. I make the flat side pieces with semicircle edge designs and cut those out. I fixed all of these roof pieces together using small folded paper pieces and creating a rectangle shape for the roof's outer edge. For the top of the roof, I used more folded paper hinges to attach large rectangles to the appropriate spaces, reinforcing the inside with more paper scraps. Rinse and repeat for the other side. I sealed up the top with another longer strip of paper before filling in the gaps and rough edges with tissues. I had to detail the inside of the roof as well, as you can see it when you look into the store. I made some half logs by cutting some thin paper strips, then wider paper strips, folding the wide strips to fit over the thin ones. I stuck these down to the inside of the roof to create a look like the roof is made of wooden logs. I added the log texture to this using the same gluing tissue scraps method, and then moved on to the paint job. I did a nice clean white for the outside of the roof as well as the inner lip of the overhang. I used the spruce brown for the logs on the inside of the roof. I applied glue to the edge of the walls and slotted the roof in place. That completes the main structure of the building, and now we can move on to the detail work, starting with the fence. Now this fence is just about the fiddliest thing that I've ever made. It involved making nets, the flat paper cutouts of 3D shapes that you probably made in primary school, for a lot of very tiny cuboids, and then attaching these nets together with L-shaped pieces of paper. It comes out to be a tad bit wonky, but screw it. It was difficult enough to get it looking this good, and I didn't have the energy to do anything about it. I then scrolled up some tubes of paper that will be sugarcane. I sealed these up with some tissue and repeated the process over a dozen times. The wheat was a similar process, just with shorter pieces of paper and leaving a bit of an overhang with the tissue to act as the tuft on the top of each wheat stalk. I also made the tree, making the shape of the trunk and branches with cones of various sizes and then blending them together with scraps of tissue. I used more tissue for the leaves by saturating it in glue and fixing it to the top of the branches. I whipped up some brown paint for the fence that's lighter and warmer than what I used for the walls to make it seem more like oak. I painted the fence brown, the sugarcane green and the wheat a yellowy orange, and wound up painting my fingers all three. For the tree is a silver birch, so I painted the trunk in a pale grey and the leaves in a muted green. I glued each of these pieces down, starting off with PVA glue but switching over to Mod Podge for the plants because PVA just wasn't strong enough to hold them in place. I also needed a pair of tweezers to position the wheat. I glued down the tree and then moved on to the furniture for the inside, starting with what ended up being my favourite piece, the bread oven. I cut the flat pieces out of card, including the rack that the bread goes on. I painted the inside before adding the curved top because I knew that I wouldn't be able to get my brush into all the crevices once it was attached. Other furniture pieces were made the same way. I took some liberty with the actual design, like the main pieces like the counter and central table were there, but a lot of the more Minecrafty details were swapped out. Like in the game, behind the counter there is a minecart for practicality's sake, but I swapped it out with a small stool because I thought it was cuter. Or how there's a chest on the central table in the Minecraft version, but I decided to make a tiered display table instead. The cakes, breads and pastries are made from polymer clay. I wasn't really worried about what colour I was using because I knew that I'd paint them anyway, and I added way more varieties of sweet treats than are in the game just because I thought it was cute. I also made a chicken and cow for the garden out of the clay. Once the polymer clay was baked and cooled down, I gave them a coat of gesso. I made a variety of plates and serving trays from paper and cardboard, including a wooden peel for the bread in the oven and a basket for the baguettes. I stuck all the pieces into these with PVA glue. I then painted everything in their logical colours, oak brown for the tables, a golden brown for the pastries and so on. I stuck the bread on its peel into the oven before doing some detail work with the paint, such as the cow spots or the cherries on the cakes. And then I started gluing everything in place, starting with the animals, then the pastries and the windows displays. I glued the plates onto the display tables and stuck in all of the furniture, so the oven, the counter and the tables. And that brings this project to a close. So that's all I have to show you this week. I know it's a bit of a random video, but I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I did. Like and subscribe if you did. It lets me know that there's something you want to see more of. I'd love to do this again, so let me know if there's anything else you'd like to see this style of diorama for. And if you want to join my channel's Discord, that'll be linked in the description. Apart from that, thanks for coming with me on this nostalgic trip, and I'll see you all later. Bye!